So have you raise your hand? Just have you heard about project-based testing? Do you know what is this at all? Okay. So let's start from the start, right? There is the whole idea of what is a property and why is useful to test here, right? And I'll keep going back. Can you read me easily? Can you see my screen and can you read me? Okay, perfect. And the whole idea here is when you do example-based testing, do you code, both of you? You write code?
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
To create testing suites, basically.
This will be a very code-centered session, right?
Okay.
And so have you ever done TDD, test-driven development? Yes, Leonardo, yes, and Ricardo, yes, too. Okay, so when you are coding and doing your testing, you are verifying usually that from some input you have some output. Yes. For this input of 3 and 4 to my addition, I have a 7 as an result. Yes. We call that example based testing. You give one example and another example and another example and another example. Input, output, input, output, input, output. Yeah, and that's a fine thing. I'm not saying property-based testing rocks and example-based testing sucks. That's not my message. They are very complementary. But the thing is, on property-based testing, I'm not trying to verify that from my input I have an output. I'm going from here is input versus output. And here we are going to types of input versus behavior. That's the main difference. Everything else in this presentation will be to run the space between those two. Okay. Oh yeah. I do not. We could do this as a real workshop where you code yourself, or as a kind of a longer presentation where I code in front of you, right? Both work for me. I was not going to do the real you code yourself things with a bigger audience, but you are small enough that taking the time to install something in your machine is maybe doable if you want. If you don't want to take the time to install something in your machine, let's just do it with my screen. You get the chance to choose later, okay? Mm-hmm. So the whole idea of property-based testing is going from this to this, to input versus output, to types of input versus behavior. But you understand that, what is a property? And for the benefit of this workshop, I would say a property is something that is always true. That's a very bad definition of property. It's just right now, and we'll change this definition later, but it's a first definition, okay? A property is something that is always true. So, for example, when to have a profit, I should have money entering that is bigger than my money leaving. Yes? This is a property, for example. And I'll give a second definition. Is something I believe is always true. So property-based testing is describing things you believe are true about your code, and having the testing framework try to find a counterexample, right? And when it finds a counterexample, you're happy. Okay? Okay. So an example will probably be good right now. I will go back and forth to this mind map here to write things down a little bit, take some notes along the way. But I'll try to explain the same thing I just explained, but with a little bit of code, if you accept. Right?
Okay.
But before I do that, I have to explain, I will, on purpose, use an old version of Java with shitty code and awful names. Those three things are on purpose on this presentation, right? And I'll give you the reason for those three things. One is that property-based testing is too often seen as a thing only for Haskell, Scala, F#, and things like that. So those very modern languages, right? Because it was born in the Haskell community, right? So I'll do it in Java 6. Just to show you, you can take any language and do this. So all my examples will be in this very old language like that. Okay? And you could do it in Pro and Python, in Bash. I have done it in Bash. Okay? Your language will not block you from doing this. That's a first important thing. Everybody joining, please put your camera and put your audio. Don't be afraid to talk in, go for it. And so that's one thing. Another illusion people have is that Pibor is often seen as something only for code that started using it. So on purpose, I will do this with very awful legacy code, right? Just to show you it is possible. You don't need to fret, you don't need to have a perfect code base or a greenfield code base to do this. I do that because most examples you find on the internet are examples just with very easy code, like addition of very clean code. So I want people to feel comfortable with, you can use this in any legacy code base with any language. Okay? And I do with awful names because your names will fail you at some moment. So I do this whole workshop with this in mind. Is that good a disclaimer for you all, people? Does that work? So let's do some awful shit code and use property-based testing with that. Okay? Have you ever done a kata, an exercise? Have you done it? Okay, katas are a series of exercises we have. I recommend them. That you train one specific movement with code with them. Okay? And there is a very common kata called the bowling kata. Have you ever done the bowling kata? Or maybe played bowling? Played bowling? Okay. If you play bowling, you know that the rules of bowling is you have balls, you have pins, and you want to throw the pins to make the balls go down, right? And you have frames and sets. Yep, you have frames. You have 10 frames in a game. Each frame you throw 2 balls. Yeah? Each frame you throw 2 balls. And you try to put down the 10 pins. Yeah? That's bowling, right? And if you want to do a function that will calculate the score of bowling, then you pass the number of pins that will go down in each frame, number of frames with the pins that go down, and you try to see how many pins go down in total. Yeah, with the exception of 2 specific situations, which is when you have a spare, is when you do all 10 pins with 2 balls. Then in that case, you double the next ball. Yeah? Double the point of the next ball. And you have a strike, is you put down all 10 pins in the first ball of a frame. In that case, you double the next 2 balls. So now you have all the rules of bowling here, right? Let's do some code, do some tests, and we'll do that. If you did this in TDD, test-driven development, what would be your first test? This is the problem. What would be your first test? Feel free to put your microphones, people. There is no reason to be muted here. Just unmute yourselves and let's just chat when we do this. We're a small group. I'm not hearing anyone. So.
Yes. I believe if someone can put a message if they don't want to talk, can put the message on the chat.
You're not forced to talk. You can put answers in the chat. Just try to interact with you. So answer for yourself. Put in the chat, everyone. What will be your first test if you were going to test this code here doing TDD? What will be your first test?
Well, I was just going to check on the. It's not double the next ball, is it? It's you add 10 to.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And Leonardo is typing on the chat, but just to me, that deal will start with at least 3 tests: no spare, no strike, strike, and spare.
Sorry.
Leonardo is saying.
Can you copy and paste it to everyone, Leonardo?
Yeah.
Just copy and paste to everyone instead of sending the message to organizer. Yes, right. Leonardo start. The first test is no spare, no strike, and spare, right? That's the thing he has in mind. I will probably myself start with doing an entire game where I put no points at all, right? Just to see and say that score is 0, right? So if I were going to do it this TDD way, right, I'll probably have something like this. Can you hear this? Is this big enough to you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'll probably do something like this, right? I'll probably do I have a bowling, a score, and I have just zeros, and the score of that is 0. Yeah. Like I said, shitty naming. That's on purpose. Just focus on the then if I were doing this in TDD, I would do the second test where I try to say, okay, like Leonardo said, okay, no spare or strikes, just some pins, and see that I have, my score is the addition of them, right? I have this tendency of trying to put the addition there instead of trying to put just 4 or something like that. That's my bias. But do you see what I'm talking about when I do this test here? Okay. Is this the way you people do tests in real life? Is this similar to that in your real code bases? Yes, maybe. I have some yeses here, right? I would say that people that are saying maybe are probably right, and people that are saying yes are probably lying to themselves. I would say that your tests are probably closer to this in real life, right? Or probably closer to this kind of thing. I have a domain which has some code that in order to create I create a test that is just calls some function or method with something, an entity that I create. So to do that, I create something that I put inside 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 something. Then I pass to my test. Does it make sense what I'm telling? Does it ring a bell? And of course, we could do this prettier, and doing this prettier is not a bad thing per se. We could have some builder or some fixtures. There are many ways we could do this in a way that is easier on the eyes. But end of the day, we'll still be doing this behavior. I try to create one example with this whole set of objects within a specific state. Use that as an entry point and expect an output. Yeah. Like I said in the beginning, this whole logic of input versus output. Yeah. And I'm not saying these tests are bad, right? This is example-based testing. It is a good thing in itself, and I hope you're doing at least this. And I'll go back to this later. Okay. I'm going to simplify and just do this kata style for the moment. Just this kind of stuff that is not really realistic. Yes? And then I'll go back again to this other stuff that is a little bit more realistic. Does that work for you people? Okay. So if I were going to do this TDD, I would say 0 is 0. I would say, oh, I have this, that gives me that, and I have a spare, and I have a more complex spare. I have a strike, a more complex strike. And then I have the perfect game, just everything, right? And this will be my test, more or less, that covers the behavior of my bowling. Yeah? And what happens here is that I'm making my examples represent classes of behavior, right? In example-based testing, one input represents a class of behavior, right? I don't want, I want to test, this is testing not only singles, it's an awful name. This is testing, this represents, this is representing every case that is not a spare or strike, yes? It's one example to represent all that. Maybe it's not enough, maybe I should give more examples. Yeah? This is also another example of spare, not spare strike, but kind of a very special one. Yeah? And this represents spares. So those two tests are, this is awkward because those two tests are together. I could organize them in some other ways, but this is testing one concept, another concept, a third concept. Yeah? And another thing that is awkward here is in this example-based testing, there is a representation, but also I would argue with you today, my friends, that tests are a tool of reasoning. When you do a test, of course, the test serves the purpose of no regression, and serves the purpose of stability, of making things stick. This is all very fine. But for me, that's even secondary. The first reason for me to do a test is reasoning, is understanding the code. Understand the behavior, right? And tests are a tool for archaeology. So if you develop in real life, I would say that it's probable that you come back to your code base and the code base don't make any sense to you at some point or the other. Yes? You don't know the whole business logic that was there used to create that code. That's a normal thing. And you look at the code and you don't know what it was supposed to do, and don't know what was the behavior that is needed, what was the thing that somebody at some point asked for something to happen and that became code, and you don't know that something there. The why is usually lost very easily in your code bases. And we use tests as a tool of archaeology, right? Let's look at this. I just explained to you the rules of bowling. Now put yourself in the shoes of somebody that have never played bowling, don't know bowling at all, right? Don't know bowling at all. Would you be able to discover by archaeology the rules of bowling just by reading this test?
There only slightly. There's like the zeros are the frames, I guess, right?
Yeah,
that was
right.
the thing. That was the thing that I was first thinking of, but I wouldn't know. But maybe I'd imagine, okay, there are 10 moves, or
Yeah,
there are 10,
right.
1,
So
2.
yes, that's the first problem, right? You don't have the frames at all. It's just the balls. Is this the balls? Is this the frames? You don't know. But it will come. But if you put yourself in the shoes of somebody that doesn't even know bowling, you don't even know you're missing the frames.
It could be innings. We don't know. It's a score.
Exactly.
It says.
Exactly. And you don't know, if you don't know bowling, you don't even know that innings and scores is a thing. So just saying, I see numbers and what is this? I don't know. And I see these numbers and I guess, okay, there is an addition here. It helps me a little bit. But would be able to understand that this represents everything that is not a sparrow strike? Probably not, right? It takes some trial and error here. So if you make your tests as a tool of archaeology, is trying to help the future person that don't have the context of that business logic there. Come back, you understand, okay, what was this all about? Yeah? So if you see your test not as a tool of stability, but as a tool of archaeology, then we don't have enough tests here. I had people come to me and say, oh, Romeu, but this is awkward, right? You don't even need those two things here, those two tests here, very complex pair. In fact, once you've done that, you can erase this one is enough, right? And I say, okay, yes, that's true for representation, but that's not true for archaeology. I argue that for archaeology, even those two here are not enough. Yeah. And I totally relate that there is a problem in this, but let's do that's true for archaeology, right? And if you accept archaeology as a goal, it changes how many examples are enough, right? It just changes it. Then it's no longer, you no longer look at the test with the same eyes again. Isn't this brilliant? It is. I'm still with the same shitty tests, with the same shitty naming. But if I changed your lenses from one of stability to a lens of archaeology, and then the feedback that becomes living is there are not enough tests in this test thing here. Yeah. And but another one that becomes living is Romeu. This is boring. Adding other tests that are just not representing any new behavior, just making this more complete for archaeology's sake is boring, and also it's confusing. It's too much. It's too many tests for too little behavior. How many tests should I be spared? Do I put a comment here to say, oh, all those tests, all this test will be to do a spare? Do I create different test classes or test inner classes? How do I organize all this shit, right? How do I manage the signal versus noise of this? Do you feel that frustration? Right.
Yes.
Yeah. But then the signal versus noise. Also, there is another frustration. This seems like a lot of boring work. I'm lazy. I don't want to come up with lots of tests, and there's a lot of boilerplate here. I don't want to read, I don't want to write this. Make sense? Do you see those two frustrations there? You feel it. You feel it in yourself, in your colleagues. So I'm very connected to that. Have you ever done a chat or raise your hand? Or who has done parameterized testing here?
I missed the question.
I'll write in the chat. Who here has ever done parameterized testing? Put on the chat.
A little bit, not too much.
Is it
Some
the same
parameterized
as
testing.
table testing or something like that?
I don't know. I have never heard about table testing, but I can show you some parameterized testing. And there's Java 6, not even Unit 5, that has parameterized testing baked in. I was just doing some awful data providers to have parameterized testing. Yeah? And parameterized testing, I just, instead of doing do you see my both test cases here? Is this big enough for you to read? Yeah? In parameterized testing, I I can say, I can go from, you can say, okay, no, those two tests here are actually testing the same concept, right? And I just reproduce them here. I put here, I put there, right? And now it becomes very cheap for me to add two other ones just because, right? Put add a fifth one, I don't care, right? Let's say all those things there represent the same concept, which is the concept of I'm having a bowling game where there is no spares or strikes. Yeah. Okay. This is already slightly better than this, but have you seen the test itself? Now it's changed. No longer I put the addition, right? It is, I'm describing a business logic here. Aha, aha. So I argue that parameterized testing is kind of halfway between example-based testing, property-based. It's example-based testing, but behavior. Okay. Now you can tell me, Romeu, we can still do input versus output, right? I could put the outputs as parameters too in the test, right? And I would argue that then you're just recreating this if you do that. If you put every input and output as parameter to a parameterized test. Parameterized test is just a test that has parameters, right? I could put a second parameter and say, oh, integers output, right? I could do that, just add another parameter. But if you do every input and every output of a function in your parameters, then for me, you're not doing anything that's fundamentally different from doing this, right? It just looks different, but it's nothing in essence has changed, right? That's why I usually have my personal rule of parameterized testing. Romeu's personal rule of parameterized testing. This presentation will contain typos, which is this one output or one input is not given as a parameter. Best testing I ever seen was testing was a case of integration testing. They were testing the first when I give HTML code. The second one I have a 404 HTML code and things like that. And I have like list of URLs and codes, URLs and codes, URLs and codes. It was input, output, input, output, input, output. And I changed it so I could have tests that give me 404, tests that three tests. But now I do not have the outputs in the parameters. And they claim clear to me that I have these three different. The connection is breaking up here, Leonardo say. Can you people hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Oh, God damn it. I'm sad about this, friends. Okay. I'll repeat myself a little bit if you're hearing me now, okay? the trials and tribulations of Zoom, right? The first parameterized testing.
At least your mic is working.
Sorry?
Yeah, at least your mic is working. I mean, have to use my cell phone with my computer. Linux doesn't like me.
My personal rule of parameterized test is at least one output or one input is not given as a parameter. If you have many outputs, at least one of those outputs is not in the parameters. Right? I do that so I ensure I'm doing inputs versus behaviors and not just inputs versus outputs with parameters, because then I could just then it's just embellishment, but not real fundamental change. I'm not saying embellishments are bad, right? I'm not saying that doing fixtures in tests is bad. I'm not using them here, but I'm not saying they are bad. Fundamentally, beauty is important. It's just not my goal in this presentation. And if you ask me why is beauty in code important, I would say that beauty in code, like in flowers, is there to ensure the means of reproduction. Make sense? Hello.
Unfortunately, you are breaking. I'm not listening you at least for 1 minute.
Okay, and now it is working, or it's still breaking?
Oh, it's working.
Perfect. So I put the mirror board in the Zoom. So it became cheaper to add new tests, and it became cheaper without going and it became clear the sign of noise, right? Tests that go together became clearer too, but at the same time. So and overall, it was an improvement, and I can only advise you to do parameterized tests a lot. It's a very interesting way to do example-based testing. And then you are in this first step towards doing behaviors, right? Here, if I did archaeology, I'd have to discover that this represents, and I counted the next one twice. And this is something I can start with writing behavior, so I can start writing down is the sum, and that sum is between 0 and 300, right? Becomes a clear thing. I'm writing down my business rules in my test. Another level. And this is still very bad. Can you people tell me why this is still very bad? And it's good, it's a good thing, it's a positive thing to do this and this. But there is some problems, some issues with this. What are the issues? How do you see?
I think that the first one is that it's getting harder and harder to maintain because you may forget your business rules. And the second one is, for example, when you have to do some code review, for the reviewer, it's getting a little bit confusing to understand and say, okay, it's the code is doing what it's supposed to do. That's my point.
Let's touch that configure, right? Confusion for the reviewer, you have to get three different confusions in mind, two very different ones. Yeah, it is not clear, and the other is the thing is unfamiliar. And you have really to ask yourself, is the confusion in one side or the other? Yes? Because getting something that is not familiar to be familiar is an investment that pays off. Okay, the person do not have yet the reference to read this in an easy way. Okay, if it's just unfamiliarity, then we can spend some time together looking at this, and some moment it becomes familiar, and then it's done, and we can go from there. Yeah. Which will never be the case in a workshop like this because you don't have the time to build your familiarity, right? Yet, if the thing is just not clear, no matter how familiar you are with this way of writing, then it will still be confusing to my reviewer. And that's what I try to touch here with you. Right? Some confusion here will be unfamiliarity, some will not. I invite you to take the time to slow down and say, okay, is this unfamiliarity? Because we are very good at convincing ourselves that unfamiliarity means this is confusing, this is bad. And I argue that here, the thing on the right carries both. There is some level of things that are just not clear, and there is some level of confusion that comes from lack of familiarity, right? And it's not helped by the verbosity of it, right? The newer versions of Java, they did this better, right? There are many keywords here that have no purpose, so it's not very helpful, that specifically. But I do in CT code with a CT old version of Java and things like that, on purpose to show something, right? The heart of it stays the same. And with this in mind, one problem I do have here myself is that this is still archaeology that is kind of difficult. I still have to, I can read this and see what is my behavior, but I still have to look at those inputs they have in common. Of course, I could document it, right? But it's not immediately clear what do they have in common. Does it make sense?
Yeah, one thing I was thinking between the test on the left and the test on the right, that the word score is a lot closer to the data that you're passing in for your score. And then all of a sudden on the right, while I like having the data there, it makes it easier to maintain when it's sets of data. It makes it harder to read what it is. It's just a bunch of numbers, you know, when you first look at it. And you have to go into the code to actually see that it's a score down below that you're testing.
Yeah, clearly, beautifully, but yeah, right. It helps compare, but then it becomes maybe is a trade-off. Yeah. And there is another thing I dislike about this. I mean, I like this a lot, but there's some things I dislike in it. And there's another thing that I dislike about this is that I'm lazy and this is boring. Writing all those inputs is kind of a pain, right? And also, remember when I say that your real life tests are not just integers, right? In real life, you're doing a lot of this. So it's still not very comfortable. It's still a little bit painful. Make sense? So I mean, in some ways, it's an improvement. Right? At all. And I say, okay, what could we do? We could try to make the computer do this for us, because this is still representation, right? It's just 4 examples, but there are many others. We don't know if they work or not. They represent a class of behavior, right? What if we could have as input the entire class of behavior? Just put as an input to my test potentially any one given game that is not a spare, not a strike. Yeah. Now, this is a small problem, so we could probably actually put in memory all of them and try. But it's kind of maybe too much. Yeah. I just want my code to work with any and not necessarily test all. Because all is just too big, right? I mean, if I just had a string, it already becomes too big, right? Testing every possible string starts to become very complicated, yeah? Because the entire works of Shakespeare in Korean and Japanese is one string, one possible input of just string, yes? So testing every possible input is probably not something I want, but I want to be able to just have the assurance my code works with any valid input, not all at the same time, but any valid input, right? And the way to do this, testing that my code works with any valid input, but not all the inputs tested. And the way to do this is I take random inputs. Let's think about a property here. What is something, remember in the beginning I said a property is something true about your tests. Remember when I say that? Something that I will think is always true about your code, right? In our test that 2 plus 2 equals 4 and 3 plus 5 equals 7, right? I try to create a property of the plus function. What is a possible property of the plus function? Well, there is a property of increasing, right? If I add 2 positive numbers, the number that will come out will not be smaller than any of those 2. Yeah? This is a property. It can be equal. I could add 0 and 0 and have 0, right? And if I add in 2 different numbers and they're both positive, and the result will be bigger than any one of those two numbers. Yeah? This is a property. And then if I have that property, I know, I believe this is always true. If I believe this is always true, I will have, I don't care what are the inputs. They can generate, any positive number. Any positive number you give me is a valid input. Does it make sense? What I say? I'm not caring about the number. I'm describing what is a valid number, having the testing framework generate that number for me and use that. And I don't care which one it picks. Does it feel strange to you, the idea of generating random input? Let's do a little bit, right? Let's slow down and do a little bit of it. Yeah? I'll ignore this for the moment. I'll go back to addition increases in, and say that if I have two numbers, A plus B is greater than A is greater than B, right? This is a property. If I say I believe this is always true, will that work? I take any numbers A and B, and I say, well, A plus B will be greater than A and will be greater than B. Will that be true? What do you believe, friends? That will be false, right? If you find a counterexample, what will be the counterexample?
You should have 0.
Well, if one of the number is negative, for example, will already not work, right? And 0, right? Now it's the first time I'm executing it, compiling Java, etc., but the tests themselves are not very slow. And it has found many problems, right? So if I have A0 and another number, any other number, do you see my error message here? It's telling, okay, if I have 0 in this number, it's not true. It's not true. It's not greater than, right? So, and I say, okay, sorry about that. Assuming that A is bigger than 0. Yeah? Okay. Sorry. Assuming that A is greater than 0. I keep forgetting that. Yeah? And assuming that B is greater than 0. If I assume that when you generate input, please, I want input that respects this, right? Assumptions versus assertions is, this is my preconditions, this is what the result I will have, right? Generate me any A and B, but they have to be greater than 0. And then I assert that this will be true. And then it still will not pass, right? I will still have a problem. What will be the problem? Have people seen what is the problem? Those two numbers here, if I add them, it will not be bigger. What will be the problem?
Is there an overflow here?
Integral overflow, my friends, right? And the goal is not to do perfect issues you run into, okay? Right. What I'm saying is, I understanding my input space and well enough to say, in this input type, I will have this behavior. And then I'm letting my generators create the input, try to prove me wrong. Yep. And that's the point. Property-based testing is a bet. In the same way that an insurance policy is a bet, right? Every insurance policy is betting. You are betting with your insurance company, I will have a fire this year, or people will steal things from me this year. And they are betting with you, you will not. And you're happy to lose the bet. Make sense? With property-based testing, what I say is, I'm betting with you that if you give me any input that satisfies these conditions, then I will have this behavior. And the framework is trying to tell you, I will prove you wrong. So a red test, a red test means, ha, I got you, I proved you wrong. And a green test means I could not prove you wrong this time. Doesn't mean I will not prove in the future, but I could not prove you wrong in this time. Yes? And maybe part of you is saying, oh, Romeu, then my tests are not very representative right now. I mean, if they could fail in the future, but not today, am I losing into stability here? And the answer is no, you're not, actually. You're gaining. I argue with you that it is always the case that a red only means I have not got you this time, but I'll get you the next one. But in this case here, the test says that, but it doesn't change anything between the two times. So it keeps trying the same stuff. And here you are increasing the chances that someday you'll find something different. Now you could have other properties in addition, right? For example, you have a neutral, x plus 0 and 0 plus x is equal to x, right? Or you have associativity and things like that. I don't really like, I think all real life, I'm not testing mathematical properties. Real life, I'm testing business logic myself. And what I want to tell you today, if you do like BDD, behavior-driven development, every ID you have in your spec, usually when you try to do BDD, you have to push people to give you examples, right? They don't want to tell you, when I have a child with that many kilos and I put my medication over this many milligrams, then the child dies. They want to tell you, oh yeah, every medication has a death threshold, right? That's the thing that your business people want to give you. And you have to push them to give you examples, right? And in property-based testing, you're using that. If you ask for examples, because that's curate this initial bet of this is a behavior and put it into code too. And it's a beautiful thing. So I could say, and this is a very bad case, right? I'm just saying, oh, I have integrals between 0 and 4, so I'm missing some cases here, but it's just to make this, I try to push you to do less bad than today, not to do perfect. And say, okay, if I have this list here, then the score is the sum of the balls, and it's between 0 and 90, right? Establishing the nominal case here as a property. And now I went from, I went from input versus output to input versus behavior to types of versus behavior when I did that. It's powerful. It's powerful. And all I have is a familiar but powerful. And now I'm describing what is the things I have and what is the things I would get. And if once you get familiarity with this, you can use this to understand your business logic rather quickly. Of course, maybe you want to have this and some examples. You can mix, right? You don't need to do, you should probably have both to give you a clear picture. But you should add this. The property-based testing is a real good quick win. You can start playing with this today and start discovering things about your code base. And actually, I do that a lot. Just use this property-based testing as a tool to discover behavior in the code base. And as a tool to have discussions with business people. Because the code base knows things that no human beings know about the domain, right? I've worked with code base that are like 15 years old, and they know things, there are things coded there that no human being remember in the company. And I can just say, okay, if I have these inputs, what will be the output? What will be the behavior? How will the code behave in these situations? And then I go back and discuss this with business people and say, okay, does this make sense? Does behavior make sense? Is this a bug, or is this something you don't know about your domain? And it regenerates very interesting discussions. So back to, because how much time do I have left? Yeah, not. So back beginning, right? I say, oh, okay, bowling is not a good example of what you have in real life, right? It is not. It is not. I have, for example, something like coordinates. This is just a generator. I have not. Let's not go there yet. Good. Yeah. If I had a class generator, right? I want to test if we are a coordinate. A coordinate is in the north hemisphere or not. So I have this class coordinate here. It's a shitty class, but has a boolean that is in the northern hemisphere or not. And I want to test it. Well, I could write a property like this. Give me any big decimal, and I want latitudes that are greater than 0 and less than 90, and longitudes that are between this and this. And I create coordinates, and I assert I am in the northern hemisphere. If this is all true, then I am in the northern hemisphere. Thing is, it becomes quite hard to have those things repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating. I end up discovering I have this class of behavior. You probably want to create some code in the code space that probably want to generate, have a generator, have something that generates valid data for you. You start repeating. And you probably discover new classes when you do this. Like doing a lot more of this, right? You're saying, okay, I'm trying to test. I have a patient taking a drug at this dosage during this period of days. That is create a prescription, and this prescription for this patient should have this behavior, and the behavior is it kills. And it's obvious to everyone it kills because of this line, right? Or it's not obvious to no one, right? Everything else here is created just because it was mandatory. Have you ever seen that? You want to create fixtures, but this is the important part. In everything else, I just needed to use something because I cannot create my object without them, right? But it could be any other value and it should not change my behavior at all. Change the behavior, then it can be a random string. If this doesn't change the behavior, then it can be a random number, right? If it will not be used in my test, then I can replace by random. If I replace by random, it doesn't change anything, then it's good. And then all these examples go away, and I just keep with the thing that was useful to me, right? And I end up with a test that resembles this. I argue is less visually charged and is helping me to see what's happening. I just have a generator that gives me a prescription with random data and say on this random data, please, I want this part to be greater than 3. Yeah. And if that's true, then I have an letter is little. Bam. Smaller to the point. I know what is the part that is used. And when I get a red, I know that I have misunderstood my domain code. Only having a dosage that is big is not the only case where you have those kinds of alerts. I have this naivety in the beginning. Does it make sense? I'm telling you that random generators are your friends. Instead of trying to create those by hand, those one examples that represent a lot of cases, create what is put in the code, what is the logic that made you create those examples. And let the generators do that work. And you do a work that is less boring, and it will document better your code. It will make things more understandable to you in the future, and will test more things. It's a win-win-win situation. Please play with property-based tests. Create your own generators. Try this out. And in this case here, and it's a real-life situation that I had, I thought was only the dosage, but it actually was many other things that could make things work like this. For example, in this case would be is pregnant. If the patient is pregnant, then the dosage changes. Do you have any questions? Because we are arriving at the end, I want to leave you like the 6 minutes left. I want to leave you some space to ask questions.
Romeu, Leonardo is asking something on the chat, if you can.
Oh yeah, oh yes, please. Leonardo asked on the chat, I see you using quick check. Is the best version for a modern version of Java? No, I'm doing on purpose of doing things compatible with Java 6, right? I'm just trying to know better what is the situation of a code base without even editing any file in your current code base. You can create another test to play with this, with property-based testing today, right? You don't even need to edit any file, just add a new one that does property-based testing. And you could do this even in Java 6. Or older versions of C# or Bash or Python. So I wanted to show that way, right? But you probably have some better, in Java 14, I have not seen the latest libraries, but you probably have some better things right now with Unify and things like that. I'd rather take if I were you, I would take a very good property-based testing library for Python called I have worked into making versions of that for Java, but I don't know how mature they are. And you can just look at your Google for your language and property-based testing, and you'll find things. Make sense?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
And a common question that I get a lot is, Romeu, but what about continuous integration or continuous deployment, right? If I do a test that works on my machine and it's random, right? Maybe 1 year later, you discover that the random input generator will discover the counterexample that will show me that it doesn't work, right? It's an edge case. Would not that be a problem? And I would say no. You celebrate that you discovered that at some day. And if it's not very frequent, it's not really a problem. If it's frequent, you see in your machine, right? And of course, what question becomes is, Romeu, I have this CI/CD pipeline, and it passed on my machine, and then when I committed, it was executed and did not pass on the other side. What do I do? Let's say you do the same thing that you do when it passes on the machine, but your QA person arrives and say, hey, I found this bug. The exact same thing you do in that situation and do in the situation. Treat the random number generator as a QA person. Any questions or you want to share? Surprises you want to share? Things you want to say?
Do you have a GitHub repository with some examples of that'd be useful?
I have not put those things in GitHub yet, and it's been some years since I started doing them. I don't know why. I should totally do this. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay, friends. I hope that was useful to you. Thank you very much for coming, and have a nice day. Enjoy, and please try it at home.
Thank you, Romeu.
Thank you, friends.
Thank you, Romeu.
You can find me on Twitter, right? So just I forgot about to introduce myself, but I work at the Boston Consulting Group, and you can find me on Twitter. My profile, Romeu Moura, and you find me easily. Okay? And LinkedIn and things like that. See ya.